Hi, Dave Scotland for aetutes.com, and welcome to another exciting tutorial. And today we're going to take a look at an effect that is inspired by the Hyundai i45 TV commercial. This is the effect that we're going for here. I'll just put that on loop. The actual TV commercial itself doesn't actually use CG to create the fluidic designed raindrops. What it actually does is use a 720 nozzle water rig that sits up in the light trellis, and that water rig is controlled by computer graphics, and so basically you design your computer graphics, and then those graphics are fed into a control system that switches on and off the water nozzles up in the water rig. So what we're going to try to do here is replicate the effect using After Effects and Particular. And basically the final output of the tutorial isn't really the most important thing. The real importance comes with the technique that we use, and being able to use that technique and take it into your own work using your own imagination. A good example would be to take the same technique that we've got here playing on screen, and instead have someone standing there holding an umbrella and having rain come down in various shapes or messages or text, and sort of bouncing off the umbrella. And you can use this same technique that we're about to go through to do that. And plus this technique may actually inspire you to put a few twists on the technique itself to come up with something completely original. So we hope that you do that rather than just simply recreate the TV commercial and leave it at that. So we really want you to experiment and try to push this technique further. So let's just have a quick look at what's happening in the shot. I've got a car element, which is actually a photograph that I took of my neighbour's Bentley, a beautiful, gorgeous car that he brings out of the garage about 12 times a year. And he allowed me to photograph the car, and then I took it into Photoshop and really gave it a heavy work over to give it that studio photography feel. I basically photoshopped all of the reflections out of the photograph, and did a lot of painting, and pretty much the majority of time spent on this preparing for this particular tutorial was spent doing the photo preparation for the actual car. So I really wanted to give it that photo studio feel. So you've got the car there, and you'll notice the aspect of the photo itself is very flat and front on, and we can't see across the bonnet or across the roof. It's a very front aspect photograph, and that's really going to suit the shot that we're going for here, that we get this this sort of front on look, and it hides a lot of the effect that we're going for, which is fantastic. The other element in the shot is this light trellis or light truss at the top of the shot, and I created that in 3D Studio Max, just using some splines and a little bit of creative lighting, and I created some lights to come down as well. And the lens flares are created using Andrew Kramer's fantastic plug-in optical flares, and we're going to touch on that a little bit later. And then I've also built this sort of water rig box to represent the water rig, or to basically hide the magic in behind that water rig, in behind that box there. So it's really quite a simple scene. It's sort of set in a black void, and that gives us a lot of possibilities later on for tweaking. So that's the shot we're going for. I've got three shapes sort of coming down. Now we're only going to use the one shape for this tutorial, but once you learn how to use the technique just with that one shape, you'll be able to lay out or replicate the effect using multiple shapes, as I've done here in the preview. So let's go ahead and get started. Just before we do, I'll just briefly explain to you how the effect works. We're using trap code for particles, and we're going to be setting up the particles to feel like falling water. But to drive the actual shape, we're going to be using an actual design element, an image of white on black. And in this instance, I've actually got an alpha channel included with that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. What I've got here, these are my 3 design elements in my project here. I'm in a brand new project in After Effects. I've got the sword design, which is just a very simple design that I did in Photoshop, just using some spline curves and then filling it with white. And that's a TGA that actually has an alpha channel as well. And if I just toggle my transparency, you can see that that element is actually chopped out with an alpha channel. I've also got the car graphic, and that's just, as I said, it was a photo that I took and spent a lot of time just to make it look and feel like a studio shot. Put in some ground shadows and a little bit of sort of illuminated area from the lights. And the important thing to note about the image is that it's done to high definition resolution. We'll be working at a smaller resolution but to the same dimensions. Dimensions being the amount of pixels across to the amount of pixels down is going to match a high definition resolution. But the reason for working a little bit smaller is to keep things nice and sort of quick in the tutorial. But you'll be able to work at true high dev res when you attempt this tutorial. So the next element we have is just this lighting truss. And as I said, I made this in 3D Studio Max. It took me no time at all. It's very quick and easy to put something like this together, just using some splines and a little bit of basic modeling. But you'll notice in the project window that it's an RPF file. Now, an RPF file allows you to sort of bake extra information into the render, and that extra information, you'll notice up here when I highlight it, it says it's included in the render is Z depth, material effects, and Z coverage. So that'll become a little bit more apparent later on when we stitch together all of our elements into our master comp. But just thought I'd mention that it is actually an RPF file, and there's some great shoots out there on the web explaining what an RPF file is and what it does. So we'll certainly get to that in a little while. So let's go ahead and get started. And the first thing we need to do is create our composition. So there's 2 ways to do that. You can create a new comp from the drop down menu, but what I like to do is just use these little shortcut buttons in my project window. I'm just going to create a new comp, and we're just going to call this one Water Effects. And 720 by 405, you'll notice that if I just switch to a high definition 1080, it's 1920 by 1080, but if I make sure that the tick is in the lock aspect ratio, I can then change to a lower res, and the height actually automatically changes with it, and that way we're just maintaining the same resolution, just at a small, or maintain the same aspect of the image, but just at a smaller resolution. We're going to be doing this at 25 frames per second, 720/405 square pixels, and let's keep it at an even 8 seconds. And we'll go OK to that. So now we have our water effects comp down the bottom here. It's completely blank, and we can start bringing our elements down into it. So the first thing we'll do is just grab our car graphic and pull it down into our comp. Now it's a lot bigger than our comp because it's true high dev at 1920 by 1080. So we need to transform it. Just right click, bring up your transform, and then we're just going to use the fit to comp. Now we can use fit to comp because we know it's not going to squash or stretch anything, because it is the same dimensions across and down as the high dev original car graphic image. So that's in the comp now, but we're not going to be using this graphic as a renderable element in the water effects comp. It's just there for reference. So let's right click on it and change it to a guide layer, and that just brings up this little special icon here. Whenever you see that, you know that this is actually a guide layer and it won't be rendered when we use this comp in our master comp later on. So we've got our guide layer in there, and the next thing we can do, we need another guide layer, which is the light truss, just for lining up the effect. So go ahead and bring that down, put it on top of the car, and right click and change that to a guide layer as well. We'll probably delete it later on, but it always pays to just keep it as a guide layer, so that if you do use this comp, then it won't get rendered in a master comp. And the last thing we need to bring down is our sword design. So go ahead and bring that down and just pop it underneath the light truss element. And it's quite large. And what we want to do while we're resizing it here is I'm just going to slide it down a little bit so that we can see this wide part of the sword, because we're just going to hit S on that layer just to bring up scale, and we're just going to slide our scale down and then move it up slightly. Just what we're doing is we're trying to make sure that our sword, these wide parts here on the sword, do actually come out beyond the roof, so that they sort of come out onto the bonnet a little bit and onto the front windshield, which is what we're getting there. So I think that's probably going to be enough. I've used 52% on the scale there, and that's going to be fine. So we can just bump that back up again. And the next thing we need to do is actually create a mask or a track matte object that's going to reveal this sword. We're going to put some animation on the sword, and we're going to move the sword down, but it has to pass through this mask, which means that basically only what is happening inside that mask area is going to generate particles. And you'll see what I mean when I've created this mask. So let's go ahead and create a new solid, and we'll make this solid white, and we're going to call this, let's call it droplet mask, and we'll leave it 720 on the width, but the height we're going to change to just 15 pixels, and we'll go OK to that. And so what we're left there with, if I isolate it, is just a solid that is 15 pixels high and the full width of our comp. We're just going to move that down on top of our sword design. So if we unhide everything again, we can grab our droplet mask, and we're just going to slide it up and line it up with this this box that's built into the truss work at the top. And we'll just make sure we've got the right layer there, the droplet mask, and we're just going to make sure that it's just underneath that box, and that's going to work just fine. So if I hide the truss, you'll see now that we have our sword design is being sort of blocked by that mask there. Well, we want the opposite effect. So the first thing we need to do is just give ourselves a little bit of animation here. So go ahead and drag your sword up until it's just above that mask. Something like that there is fine. And then just highlight the layer, hit P for position, and keyframe a position there just by hitting the stopwatch. And if we come across to about 1 second on the timeline, and that's it there, and you can always check over here on the current time, we're going to drag that keyframe out to that 1 second mark, and that just means that we're going to get a nice bit of lead into the effect so that the viewer can establish the environment before the effect starts. And then we're just going to come out to the 3 second mark. So the sword is going to animate over 2 seconds, between 1 and 3 seconds on our timeline. And then we're just going to drag down. I'm holding the shift key to make sure it comes straight down, and I'm just going to make it just past our mask. And so you'll see there that the sword moves through the mask and all the way past. So now what we can do is grab both those layers, and we're going to layer, pre-compose, And we're going to call this water droplet emitter. And we'll move all attributes into the new composition and open the new comp. We're just going to go OK to that. Now we're in our new pre-comped composition, water droplet emitter. I've got my two layers there, and what I'm going to do is highlight the bottom layer, and I'm just going to slide back a little bit so that this, in our animation, back to about 2 seconds, and then I'm just going to use the track matte here, and we're going to use an inverted alpha matte. Actually make that an alpha matte, and you'll see what that actually does if I come in here now, that as the animation comes through, the sword goes through that track matte and reveals itself only in the only through the track matte and not the rest of the sword, and that's going to drive our particle emission, which is perfect, and that's exactly what we want. So we have our water droplet emitter. If we come back to our water effects now, you'll see that at the top of the screen, and that's going to work perfectly. And if I unhide our light trellis, you'll see that it's completely behind our light trellis, and that's what's going to work later on for our master comp. So we can grab that light trellis now and delete it. We don't need it in this comp. And the next thing we need to do is a very similar effect, but for the splash particles that hit the car. Now, particular will allow you to actually have a layer act as a barrier or a deflector, but it only works if the layer is flat, and we're not dealing with a flat layer here. We're dealing with the contours of the vehicle. So we need to work out a system of driving the splash particles that contours to the system, and the timing works with the sword and the falling particles. So this is how we're going to do that. We're just going to duplicate the water droplet emitter, but we're not going to do it down here in the comp. We're going to do it up here in our project window. So if you grab your water droplet emitter and just go Control D, it creates a second copy of that emitter, just with a 2 at the end, and we're just going to hit Enter, and we're going to rename it from water droplet emitter to water splash emitter, and we're going to go OK to that. So now we have the two emitters in our project window. We can double click on our water splash emitter just to bring it up down here in the comp window. Now it's an exact duplicate, so it's got exactly the same animation on it and the same mask. Now we want to maintain the animation, the speed of the animation, but we want to change the mask. So this is how we're going to do that. First, let's grab our droplet mask and delete it. And let's bring in our car graphic as a reference, and just right click and make it a guide layer, and also right click, transform, and fit to comp. And then it's in exactly the same place as it is out in our water effects comp. So what we want is a mask that matches the contours of the car. So just on the top here, we're just going to go Layer, New, Solid, and we'll call this car. Actually, we'll call this car Splash Mask, and we're going to go fit or make comp size. So it is 720 by 405, and we'll go OK. So we've got that full resolution solid there. And I'm just going to switch off the visibility, and we're going to draw using the pen tool. We're going to draw a mask. Now, even though the visibility is off, we can still draw the mask, but make sure that you switch on the mask and shape path visibility toggle here, just so that you can see your mask as you draw it. And we're going to slide up a little bit. I'm going to start out wide of the car, and then I'm going to come into the bumper here, and then just start drawing my mask around the bonnet. I'm just going to slide that handle up a little bit, and then we'll come up to the top of the car there, get the nice curve on the roof line, and we can always come back and tweak this, and that looks a bit out of whack, but all you do is just grab this handle here and drag it back, and we'll grab this handle, bring it up, and we'll make sure that the bonnet has that nice little sort of contoured curve, and same again there, and just on the bonnet finishing it off by coming out wide like so. Then what we're going to do is come back and actually duplicate the shape of the mask. I'm just going to do squares for now, and we can come back. Oh, actually, that's going to be fine. And so what we're doing is just duplicating the mask to a thin sort of band that matches the contours of the car. Just come across a little bit more there. We just want to make sure that we just sort of match those contours of the car nicely, and then we're going to come across and finish off the mask. Now if I switch that back on, you'll see that we have this nice white mask area there. I'm just going to switch it off and come in and just make sure that it's tidy. You have to remember, even though it's hard to see, there is a windshield through this area here, so don't pull your mask. If I grab my selection tool here and grab that mask point, don't go and pull it over here like this. Make sure that you include the window, because it's important for the actual effect itself. And make sure the top of the car, you include that full contour over the top of the car. And come across a little bit more. Just going to bring this, might be just a little bit far away from our, that's probably it there. Don't make it too thick, because this is going to be generating particles, and we don't want those particles to be too, looks like I'm way off on the windscreen there. So there's a rear windscreen as well that we need to include, and the bonnet can come up, the boot can come up a little bit, and we can probably, if you are going to make it skinnier on these more vertical lines, because there'll be less particles splashing from the top as they fall down. And the reason why, even though our sword doesn't stretch out this far, if we do this work now, then you can create the same effect using the same comp later on with a different graphic, maybe a graphic that is almost as large as the car. And because we've done this work and set this mask up correctly, it's going to work fine. Don't worry too much about this area out here. The idea is to never have particles that hit the car out beyond the car. So it's really just, we've put that out there to stay tidy with the mask. So we're looking pretty good there for our mask. And this is our car splash mask. And what we can do now is, if I do the same process, in fact it's still in place here, the alpha matte is still in place. So as we move down, you'll see that, I'll just hide the car. As the sword moves down, it now goes through that mask that we've just created. But notice that as we go all the way to 8 seconds, we don't get the handle and those wide parts of the sword. And the reason for that is, if I just take this track mat off, the reason for that is that our animation stopped here and didn't go all the way down through. But we want to maintain the speed and velocity of that animation to match our water droplet emitter, remembering that this is our water splash emitter. So what we're going to do that is just bring up P for position, and we're going to unhide our mask so that we can see it. And with the position, you'll see we've got 2 keyframes here. If I highlight position and then drag to one of the keyframes, the first keyframe, I'm clicking and I'm dragging down using the shift key just to keep straight to just above our mask. But notice, because both keyframes are highlighted, that means that move is going to basically be replicated, and the motion is going to still be the same speed as our other emitter, and that's perfect. And you'll see that it just gets beyond our car mask, our car splash mask, and it works perfectly. So now I can hide that car splash mask and change back to an alpha matte in our track matting, and you'll see that the shape of the sword goes through that car mask, and now we get the full shape splashing over the shape of the car. And that's I'll just come in and show you there, and that's exactly what we want. So now we have our two emitters. If we come back to our water effects, and then just up in the project window, we're just going to grab our splash emitter and drag it down on top of the comp. And if I hide the car, you'll see that we sort of have a replication of our top emitter and our bottom emitter, both with their various masks. Now later on, what we're going to do is offset the splash emitter by dragging it out in the timeline to basically match when the particles reach the car. When the droplet particles reach the top of the car is when we want this emitter to start, and we're going to drag that out to match that, but we won't need to do that just yet. So we can go ahead now and start creating our particles. So let's just hide our water splash emitter, and we'll start with our droplet emitter. We'll bring up our effects control, and we're going to create a new layer, new solid, and we're going to call this, let's call it water droplet or water drops particles. And let's try to keep it sort of making a little bit more sense in our timeline. We're just going to leave the color blue. The colors are not important because this is a solid just holding the particular effect, and it doesn't use any of the color information from the solid. So that's just for organization. At a glance, we'll be able to see in the timeline here that it's blue, and therefore it's sort of a water particle effect. We could even go further and right click on our color tags here and change that to blue as well. So just with that layer selected, we're going to now right click in our effects controls window and slide down until we get to trap code particular. Now I'm using particular 2, but this effect can definitely be done with particular 1. Now rather than me using the process of trial and error, which is definitely, there's a lot of tweaking involved to get this effect to really look like the water and get the gravity, speed, and all of the velocity settings correct. What I've done is save some presets, and we'll include these presets in the download. And of course the actual project file will have the information sort of baked in into the particular. But what I'll do is load the preset, and then I'll just give you a quick glance over the settings so that you understand how the effect works. So what we can do is in the particular now, I can just bring up my animation presets, and I've got my 3 saved presets here now. They're the 3 particle scenarios that we're going to be using. The droplets, we're going to be using a splash haze, which is that really fine water vapor that sort of happens when the water hits the car. And then we've got our splash particles. So we want the droplets particle, and we're just going to load that up, and what that does is loads all of the settings that I've saved in that animation preset. Now at the moment you'll see that there's no particles happening in the shot, and that's because we don't actually have an emitter. So if I go into the emitter here, you'll see that the emitter type is layer. And what we need to do, because we're going to be using these 2 layers down here, the water splash emitter and the water droplet emitter, which is these masks that we did, they're going to be our emitter objects. So the particles are going to come from those shapes. But before we can use them as an emitter, particular requires that they need to be 3D layers. So just toggle your switches and make sure that both of our emitters are 3D layers. And now we can just highlight our water drops, and layers already set up. What we need to do now is just go to the layer emitter in the emitters section of particular and change it to the droplet emitter. And now you'll see that it's using those predetermined settings that I've baked into the animation preset, and it's dropping the water relative to our shape. You'll see that as our shape comes through, it's starting to drop the water in the shape, and then watch here when it gets to this wide part, It's getting the emission of the particles from the graphic, and it's going to drop them down using our settings. Now, we don't need to physically see our emitter, so we can switch off the visibility for the emitter and the effect still works. And so I'll just step through some of the settings that I've got in this water effects water drops particles. We'll start off with emitter. I've got 400,000, and that seems quite high, but I needed a lot of particles in order to get the randomness and to get it to read on screen. But feel free to play with any of these settings once you get the project file and just see the different various effects that you can get by changing some of these settings. The direction's not important because we don't have any velocity. You'll notice that there's zero velocity being given to the particles. We're using straight gravity to get the particles to fall. The Z depth, I've put no Z size on the emitter because I want it to replicate the TV commercial, which has a Z all on the same plane. There's no Z depth to the emitter size because it's coming from those 720 water nozzles. The layer emitter, we've already gone through that there. We can come now down to particle, and in the particle settings, the life I've got set to 5 seconds because I don't want the particles to disappear before they've gone past the car. So whatever timing you give it, just remember that the life of the particles for the drops really need to go past the time that it takes to go past the car. I've got no life random. The particle type is sphere, and I've wound the feather down to 0 on the sphere so that we get nice crisp spheres in the particles. The size, the feather setting I've used is relative. I've done that because of the motion blur settings that we'll get to in a moment. The size is 1.5, and that'll be relative. The size will be relative to the size of the comp that you use. Opacity, I've got it at 54. I could go a little bit smaller on that. Let's go 45 instead of 54. Opacity over life is solid, and size over life is solid, and that's pretty much for particles. Shading, I haven't done anything in shading at all, and we can come now down to the physics. Now the physics is what took a lot of tweaking, and that's why it's good to use this preset rather than go through that process in a live scenario for this tutorial. I've got gravity at 210, and it seems quite high, but in order to get the effect relative also to the air resistance that I've got there of 0.5, in order to get the effect to work the way I wanted it to read, that gravity setting seemed to work quite nicely for me. And feel free to play with any of these settings. That's pretty much it for physics. Is just a bit of gravity, or a lot of gravity, and air resistance. Nothing else happening there at all. And I can just close up that air, and we can come now down to our auxiliary system. Now our auxiliary system, if I come in here, you can see, I'll come down a little bit further, you can see that there's tiny drops that are sort of trailing the effect, and that was apparent in the TV commercial. I wanted to bring that in as well, so I've used the auxiliary system to do that, and the emitter is set to continuous. Emitter probability is 56, and that means that you'll get particles from sort of 56% of the main particles. I've got 10 particles per second. I wouldn't go too much higher than that because you'll start to get, I'll show you if I go 30, you'll start to get these deliberate trails in the droplets there. So I mean, you can go a bit higher than 10 if you want to. We'll go for say 15, and that should be fine. The life I've kept at 1 second because I've got size over life dissipating out to 0, and I've got opacity over life dissipating out to 0. So basically what that means is that the particles, the really fine particles that trail our main particle, will drop away and eventually won't be seen to the naked eye. And that's how we've replicated that there. Opacity, I've left it at 20, which is sort of half of what we had on our main particles. Gravity, I've left at 0 because in control from main particles, I've inherited the velocity by 40%. So what that means is that those secondary particles are going to travel down. They're not just going to hang there in space. They're going to inherit some movement from our main particles. And the only other thing I've got is a bit of randomness. I've got 68% size randomness of those secondary particles and 100% randomness on the opacity. So the only other thing that I've put into particular here is I've forced, in our render settings, I've forced the motion blur to, instead of using the comp settings, I've forced it on in sort of particular. I left the shutter angle at 360, but everything seems to work fine with those. I'll switch that off and show you the difference. It really makes a big difference to the effect, and so make sure that you use some sort of motion blur, either the comps built-in motion blur or particulars motion blur, in order to get that look there. So that was a bit detailed, and I won't go into as much detail for the particles, the other two layers of particles that we need to create. But you'll notice if we unhide our car graphic that our particles actually go beyond the car. They don't look like they're hitting the car. So we need to create a mask. Now, we've already done a lot of the work for that mask. So if we come into Water Splash Emitter and grab our car splash mask, we're going to go Control C, and then we're going to come back out to our water effects and Control V. So we cut and pasted that mask in here now, and we're just going to rename it by hitting Enter, and we're going to call it just Car Mask. And if I bring up my visibility for my mask here, you'll see that that's the shape of the mask, and we want it to be a little bit different to that. So what we're going to do is grab the points that are at the bottom part of the mask and leave the contours at the top part of the mask. And we're just dragging these points down and out of our vision, or out of the resolution that we're working to. So just drag them off like so, and just keep working with just the bottom ones. Leave the top ones because we really want to maintain the contour of the car. And so what you're left with, if I unhide this layer, is this white mask that is the exact contour of the car, and that exactly matches our splash elements. So now that we've got that mask, what we can do is use it as a track matte. Just use your toggle switches and set the track matte for water droplets to inverted mask, or alpha inverted matte. And so now you'll see that when our drops come down, they hit the car. They look like they're actually hitting the car now, instead of coming all the way through. And that's exactly what we want. And we can use that car mask with the other particle elements that we're going to be creating. So that's why we created it up front. So let's go ahead and move on to our splashes now. And we'll create a new solid, and we'll call this, let's call this Water Splash Particles. Make sure we spell it correctly. And we want it the comp size, leave it blue, and go OK. Now we're just going to drag it down on top of that car mask. Now notice in the timeline that we now have a light, and it's been automatically created when we used a layer as an emitter in particular. Particular automatically created a light and called it the water droplet emitter by default, and actually locked it. So if you see that, that's perfectly natural. That's what Particular does when we use a layer to create particles. So we'll highlight our water splash particles, And what we're going to do, there's an alternative way. Instead of creating particular and then loading the animation preset, we can just go to our effects and presets window over here and just use the user presets, which is where I've saved those animation presets, and grab the water splash particles and drag them over into the effects. And what that will do is actually create the effect, and the only thing missing is our emitter. We need to select the layer, which is our water splash emitter. And so if I isolate that now, you'll see that we have our splashes happening on the roof of the car. Now, it also needs our car mask. So let's grab that car mask, Control D, and drag the copy that we've just duplicated up above the water splash particles, and change the water splash particles track matte to alpha inverted matte. And so now you'll see we get this nice cut off here. If I bring up our car graphic, you'll see that we get this nice cut off. There's our splashes happening across the roof of the car, and you'll see that those settings that I've baked into the animation preset are working nicely. Let's have a quick look at some of the subtle differences. I've got a lot more particles happening there in the particles per second, and this time around I've actually got some directional velocity happening. So I've got my direction to directional. I've got my directional spread to 70. I could probably drop that back to 60, take a little bit of the chaos out of it. But the rotation in the X is minus 90, and that means that the particles are going to go up instead of down or to the front or to the left or right. And by having 60 on the spread, they're not just going to go straight up, they're actually going to go off. If I wind this directional spread down to 0, you'll see that the particles go straight up, and we don't want that. So let's bring our directional spread, let's make it an even 50, and that just brings a bit of chaos in there, which is what we want. Velocity I've got it set to 170. The velocity random 71. Pretty much copy those and then tweak them from there, and you can play with the settings. Nothing on the pre-run for the emission extras. I'll have a look at the particles. Particles pretty much match the water size, the water droplet particles. No feather on a sphere. Life is 1, so the life is a lot less, because I do actually have in the particles here, I've got some size over life diminishing down to 0, because they sort of break up as they sort of emit out off the surface of the car and break up to the point that we can't see them anymore, and the opacity over life is also diminishing down to 0. I've got the opacity at 40. I could probably bring that back to about 30, let's say 35. And everything else is, I've got some size random too built in there, which is probably a good idea. You'll see I've got some different sizes happening. Shading we didn't touch. Physics, I've got quite a lot of gravity, and the reason why I've got a lot of gravity is as the particles hit the surface, they come off at a really quite a fast speed, but I don't want them to just continue going up into the air. I wanted gravity to kick in and bend them back down towards the surface. And the only way to do that was to really ramp up the velocity and then ramp up the gravity down here. I don't have any air resistance except for, say, 0.5, so it's not a lot of air resistance, just a little bit of subtle air resistance. So that's it for physics. And my auxiliary system, very similar to the last one, velocity is quite high. I've got the particles really quite small, so my auxiliary particles are really small. Opacity is down to 20, and then over life I've got dissipating over life, and then opacity over life I've also got dissipating down to 0 as well. Color from main 100, and then down in the random I've got a little bit of life random, size random, and a lot of opacity random there. And so the only other thing that I've got is my rendering is motion blur. I've forced it in particular. So if I switch that off, you'll see it really makes a big difference to what we see in the shot. So leave that on there. And so now you'll see that we have our two particle layers. If I switch on my other water droplets here, but we have a problem, and that problem is basically our water splash particles. If I come out, you'll notice our droplet particles are still right up here, but our water splash particles are already happening. And as I mentioned before, we need to offset the emitter. Now, the easiest way to do that, let's just hide the water splash particles. Let's hide those and unhide the splash emitter, which is what's driving the water splash particles. Now, you'll see if I come down here, and I'm just going to hide the car. If I come down here, there's our water splash emitter. And what we want to do is come along in our timeline until those droplets from the top reach that emitter. So let's bring it back, and it's just about there. And now what we can do is grab our water splash emitter and slide it across until we're right at the tip of the sword. And that's it there. And now you'll see, if I just go one frame at a time, that as the sword hits that emitter, it's perfectly aligned, and it even more apparent as we come up to the thick part of the sword here. It's perfectly aligned to the shape that it should represent when it hits the car, and that's exactly what we want. So now if we switch the visibility of our water splash emitter off and switch our water splash particles back on, it's going to splash up off the car exactly the way it should. So here it's just in the center here, but then when we get over to this position here where it's wider, we're getting our water splash particles happening all around the wider part, and that's exactly what we want in our shot. So we can come out a little bit here now, and we're just about finished with our water effects. We've just got one more effect to do, and that's the haze, the water haze. So we're just going to go Layer, New, Solid, and we're just going to call this one Water Haze Particles, and make it comp size, and we'll go OK. We're going to move that down above the car mask there, just below the lights. We're going to Control D on the car mask and drag it up above the water haze particles, and we're just going to set it to an alpha inverted matte, and that gives us that shape there. Now with the water haze particles, we're going to drag across from our animation presets our splash haze and drag it up into here. Now of course it's missing the emitter, and in this instance we're going to be using the splash particles, the water splash emitter, because we want it to emit from exactly the same place as our water splashes. So let's drag it down, water splash emitter, and you'll see that we have this sort of fine haze that happens. And one of the main differences, it really does mimic a lot of the settings from the water splashes, but feel free to go through this when you open the project file and really reverse engineer it and have a good look at how it's been set up. The particle is actually a cloudlet particle. I've got the life set down a little bit, and one interesting part of this haze is that it's a cloudlet, and size over life is set to get larger as the life goes on of the particle. So as it gets closer to 1 second of life, it's much larger than it is when it stops, and that tends to be how this spray works. It sort of sprays out quite small and then gets larger as it dissipates and goes into invisibility, and that's where we've got our opacity over life is the opposite, and it goes down to no visibility. So that's pretty much our water haze. There are some other subtle differences there, especially in the there's no auxiliary system. The physics are a little bit unique given that there's no gravity involved, because we're using, in the emitter, we're using straight directional spread, directional velocity, 15 on the velocity. And so definitely have a look at the haze and how it differs from the splashing. but it gives such a subtle change to the effect that the effect really isn't as believable without that haze happening. So we now have our water effect, and we can now start creating our master comp. So let's go ahead in our project window and create a new composition, and we're just going to call this one master comp, and we're going to go 720 by 405, 25 frames at 8 seconds, and we're just going to go OK to that. And so there's our master comp there. We'll give ourselves a little bit more space so we can see what we're doing. Come across here a bit more, and what we can do is drag our water effects straight down into the comp, and you'll see if I come slide through the timeline a little bit, we've got our water effects happening there. We can drag our car graphic down into the comp, and this time it's not a reference layer, it's the proper end render that we want. So right click, transform, and fit to comp, and then it's going to be perfectly positioned where we want it. And we want our light truss, so we're just going to drag that down now. Now you'll notice straight away that our light truss is in front of our water, which is natural. It's on top of the layer, so it should be. But if I drag it down below it, it's the sword or the water is now on top of it, and we don't want that. So how do we get around that with just one render? Well, this is an RPF file, and an RPF file has Z depth, and we can use that Z depth by using an effect, just with it highlighted there. We're going to right click, 3D channel, and we're going to go depth matte. Now watch what happens as I wind this slider into the negative. It starts to reveal that element back in Z space. And what we can do is bring it, just wind it enough so that it's just past the front of the light truss. About there is fine. And then what we're going to do is invert it, like so. Because this is below the water, we want the light truss back here to be visible behind the water stream, which it is there. Then we're going to grab it, Control D, and move the copy above the water effects and take off the invert. And so now we have one layer that is split perfectly, and we have our water happening behind the front of the light truss and in front of the back of the light truss, which is exactly what we want in this shot. And you'll see that everything's working nicely there. So what we can do now is I want to give these lights some treatment, and I'm going to use the Andrew Kramer optical flares, which is a great plugin for lens flares. And what I'm going to do in preparation for that is, you'll notice in my project window that the RPF also has material effects. So I was able to bake in material ID or identifying number for that white, as opposed to any other materials in the 3D element. Only the white has a unique ID of 2, and we use a very special effect for that. So grab your light truss, pull it down on top. So we've got our new copy of light truss. I'm just going to isolate it. I'm going to use my effects control. I'm going to right click, 3D channel, and ID matte. And what ID matte is, it gives me the auxiliary channel of object ID, but in this instance it's material ID that I set up, and it's a material ID of 2. So if I select 2, now I only get the lights in the scene. And if I switch off my background there, you'll see that it's perfectly chopped out the lights of the light truss, and that's exactly what we want. So we can use that to generate or to feed that into optical flares. But before we do, we need to pre-comp it. So let's go Layer, Pre-Compose, and we're just going to call this BG Lights, and we're going to move all attributes into the new composition and open the new composition. So we'll go OK to that, and so there's our lights only, And if we come back out now to our master comp there and switch on the rest of the layers, then we have our BG lights happening in the scene like that. So let's create a new layer, a new solid. This is for our optical flares. So we'll just go OF for optical flares. We'll make it the comp size, we'll make the color white, and go OK. So we've got this solid that's now over the entire scene, and we're just going to slide down to, I've got my Video Copilot optical flares, and I'm just going to drag it into the effects of that OF solid that we just created. And by default it just creates a sort of an optical flare with a black background. Now what we want to do immediately is change the render mode from on black to on transparent. And the other change we need to make is the positioning mode. We need to change to luminance, and then select the source layer. Once we change that to luminance, it gives us this luminance options, which includes source layer, and we're going to choose the BG lights, and straight away it's created these beautiful optical flares only where our lights are, and that's exactly what we want. So let's just wind the threshold down. Wind the threshold up a little bit, just a little. That's about it there. Just, you'll notice it gives a bit of variation. Some of them are a little bit brighter than others, and I sort of like that look. So let's go ahead and keep that. Now I'm going to bring up the options for optical flares, and this is going to fit all right, I hope. Yeah, that looks okay. And we're going to use one of these presets. He's got some, Andrew Kramer's included some great presets. So let's go show presets, and we might have a look in maybe the motion graphics and see if we can find something nice in there. Yeah, there's some nice options in there. I think I'll go with looking for a sort of a bluey one that doesn't need a lot of deleting of elements. Maybe we'll go back up and have a look in the light. I sort of like this one here, the beam. That could be the one we'll go with. Yeah, I'm going to go with beam. Now, while I've got the preview up here of that particular choice, I'm going to get rid of some of these elements. I don't want these circles here because we've got so many lights that those circles are just going to end up covering. They're going to be used for every single light. So we're just going to find those, and that's this multi-iris here, and we can hide it to make sure that it's the right one. And I'm just going to delete that one away. I'm going to come down further, and basically what I'm looking for are all the elements that I don't want repeated over and over again in the shot. And so I'm just going through now and finding those elements that I don't want all over the place. Maybe these little dots at the top here we could probably get rid of if I can find them. Multi-iris, I'd say, is it. Yep. So we'll get rid of the multi-iris, and that looks pretty good. Let's have a look at it. So we just go OK. That's pretty good, but you'll see that it really does have a poor effect when you've got a repetitive element in it. So let's go back into options again and just get rid of these little flecks that are happening. Is that one of them? No. It's not that iris. Is it the glint? It's not the glint. Sparkle? No. No. There's one of them, iris, and it's probably this other iris beneath it. And now we'll go OK to that. So I'm happy with that now. We'll go OK, and there's our effect there. I think it's working quite nicely. So we can just close up that effects tab, and there's our master composition as it appears at the moment. And the only thing I want to do now is just give it a little bit of post contrast with some curves. So I'm just going to go layer, new, adjustment layer, and we'll just call this curves, and just with that selected, I'm going to put an effect of color correction curves, and I'm just going to give it some contrast by darkening it down a little bit. Just bring it back up a little bit on the top end of the contrast curve. Something like that's looking good. And just, I'd like to make the blue a little bit more uniform, so let's just go into the blue channel of the curves and just bring that blue up a little bit, but bring the red out so that we get rid of this purpley tinge to it. And I think that's working nicely. Okay, so what I'll do is do a quick RAM preview, and we'll come back and have a look at what we're left with. So I'm just hitting 0 on my number pad to start the RAM preview. Okay, so that's finished RAM previewing. I'll play it back, and you'll see that we have our shape falling from our emitter at the top, and it's bouncing on the car. It's adhering to all the contours of the car, and it's working exactly the way we want it to work. And of course, you know, it's up to your individual taste as to how much velocity you give the bounce particles, the splash particles, and how big you make that haze. But basically, that's you know, I'm quite happy with that effect, given the amount of time that we've spent on it. Not bad at all. So hopefully what we've done here is shown you some techniques that will inspire your imagination to utilize this technique in your own original format. And sky's the limit as to what you do with this technique now. And I really suggested you do some good experimentation, really familiarize yourself with driving particles from graphic elements and using creative masks and just use certain parts of those graphic elements to drive the particles. And there's so much you can do with this effect that I really suggest that you do some good experimentation with it. So that's it for this effect. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. All of the source files will include all of the settings that we've used here, and like I said before, particular one will do the same effect. I'm not 100% sure whether the animation presets will actually suit particular one, but you'll certainly be able to reverse engineer the project file and get the effect working the way you want it. So that's it for me. Until next time, bye for now.